Welcome to this journey into the shadows of forgotten history. I'm your guide through the archives of the unexplained, and tonight we delve into a case that has remained sealed in the dusty records of Yazoo County, Mississippi for over a century. Before we begin, I'd like to know, where are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. There's something uniquely unsettling about sharing these stories across time zones, knowing that somewhere it's always midnight. The year is 1893. The American South is still recovering from the wounds of the Civil War, nearly 3 decades past. In the remote plantations and estates scattered across Mississippi, the old order clings desperately to its fading power. The grand mansions that once symbolized wealth and influence now stand as monuments to a dying era, their walls holding secrets that the families within would kill to protect. In the heart of Yazoo County, approximately 12 miles from the nearest town, stood the Whitmore Estate, a 3-story antebellum mansion surrounded by 200 acres of cotton fields, cypress groves, and swampland. The house itself was a masterpiece of Greek Revival architecture, with 6 towering columns, wraparound porches, and 23 rooms filled with imported furniture and crystal chandeliers. But by 1893, the paint was peeling, the gardens had grown wild, and the staff had dwindled from 30 servants to just 7. The Whitmore family had ruled their small corner of Mississippi like kings for 3 generations. Benjamin Whitmore, 55 years old, was the patriarch, a former Confederate officer who never quite accepted that the war was over. His wife, Eleanor, 48, maintained the illusion of Southern gentility even as their fortune crumbled around them. Their 3 adult children still lived in the mansion. Jonathan, 28, who drank more than he worked. Margaret, 25, engaged to a banker's son from Vicksburg, and Charles, 22, who spent most of his time hunting in the surrounding woods. Among the 7 remaining servants was Thomas Abernathy. 42 years old, he had served the Whitmore family for 23 years. He was the head butler, the most trusted servant in the household. He managed the other staff, kept the accounts, and knew every secret passage and hidden room in that massive house. Thomas was a free man, but in practice, his life belonged to the Whitmores. They owned the small cabin where he lived on the property. They decided when he could leave the grounds. They controlled everything. Thomas had a daughter. Her name was Sarah. She was 16 years old in the spring of 1893, and she worked as a housemaid in the mansion. By all accounts, she was a quiet, obedient girl who kept her head down and did her work without complaint. On April 14, 1893, Sarah Abernathy was found dead at the bottom of the main staircase in the Whitmore mansion. The official report filed by the local constable stated that she had tripped while carrying a heavy load of linens and fallen down the stairs. An accident, nothing more. Thomas Abernathy requested permission to see his daughter's body before burial. Permission was denied. He asked for an independent investigation. His request was ignored. He begged to know exactly what happened. Benjamin Whitmore told him to return to his duties and be grateful that the family was covering the burial expenses. 3 days after Sarah was buried in the servants' cemetery behind the estate, Thomas returned to work. The other servants later reported that he seemed different, quieter. His eyes had changed. One cook would later tell investigators that it was like looking at someone who had already died, but whose body hadn't realized it yet. For the next 6 months, Thomas Abernathy performed his duties with mechanical precision. He showed no emotion. He made no complaints. He was the perfect servant. But in the darkness of his cabin, by candlelight, he was writing, page after page in a leather-bound journal. Some entries were in English. Others were in a cipher that would take investigators years to partially decode. and some passages were written in a language that no scholar has ever been able to identify. On October 31, 1893, a storm rolled in from the Gulf of Mexico. Weather records indicate it was one of the most severe autumn storms in Mississippi history. The rain came down in sheets. The wind howled through the cypress trees, and the Whitmore Estate, already isolated by distance, became completely cut off from the outside world. The roads turned to impassable mud. The telegraph lines went down. The storm would last for 3 days. When it finally cleared and the authorities made their way to the Whitmore Estate, they found something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Something that the local newspapers would report in whispers and euphemisms, afraid to print the full truth. What they found would challenge everything they believed about revenge, justice, and the nature of evil itself. To understand what happened at the Whitmore Estate in those 3 dark days of October 1893, we must first understand the world that created Thomas Abernathy and the family he served. The Mississippi of 1893 was a place caught between 2 ages, where the old plantation aristocracy fought desperately to maintain control, even as their economic and social power eroded beneath them. The Civil War had ended in 1865, but its aftermath still poisoned the South. Reconstruction had officially ended in 1877, but the scars remained deep. The Whitmore family, like many former slaveholding aristocrats, had seen their wealth decimated. The 200 slaves they once owned were gone. The cotton market had collapsed and never fully recovered. The family's investments in Confederate bonds and currency had become worthless paper overnight. But the Whitmores refused to adapt. Benjamin Whitmore had fought as a captain in the Confederate Army, participating in several major battles, including Shiloh and Vicksburg. He returned home in 1865 to find his world destroyed, and he spent the next 28 years trying to resurrect a ghost. He hired former slaves and poor whites as servants, paying them barely enough to survive, treating them with the same casual cruelty he had once reserved for human property. The estate itself reflected this decay. Built in 1842 by Benjamin's father, the mansion had once been a showpiece of Southern wealth, but by 1893 the family could barely afford basic maintenance. The roof leaked in a dozen places. Several rooms on the 3rd floor had been closed off entirely, their furniture covered with sheets, their windows boarded up. The once magnificent gardens had become overgrown jungles of kudzu and wild roses. The slave quarters, empty since the war, stood like a row of rotting teeth behind the main house. Local newspapers from that period paint a picture of a family living beyond its means, desperately clinging to respectability. The Vicksburg Herald published a society column in March 1893 announcing Margaret Whitmore's engagement to Robert Thornton, son of a prominent banking family. The engagement was clearly a financial arrangement. The Whitmores needed money. The Thorntons wanted the prestige of an old aristocratic name. Neither family seemed particularly concerned with Margaret's opinion on the matter. Jonathan Whitmore, the eldest son, was known throughout Yazoo County as a drunk and a violent man. Court records show 3 separate assault charges filed against him between 1889 and 1892, all dismissed after Benjamin Whitmore paid compensation to the victims and made the charges disappear. Local tavern owners had been instructed not to serve him, but he kept his own supply of whiskey in the mansion's wine cellar. Charles, the youngest, was perhaps the strangest of the 3 children. He rarely spoke to anyone outside the family. He spent days at a time alone in the woods surrounding the estate, hunting deer, wild boar, and occasionally something else. One local hunter told the Yazoo City newspaper in 1891 that he had once stumbled upon Charles Whitmore standing over the body of a neighbor's dog, skinning it with clinical precision. When asked what he was doing, Charles had simply smiled and said he was practicing. Eleanor Whitmore maintained the fiction of gentility through sheer force of will. She hosted tea parties that no one attended. She ordered dresses from New Orleans that the family couldn't afford. She treated the servants with a particular kind of cruelty that came from someone who had once been served by dozens and now had to make do with 7. Former servants who left the estate told stories of Eleanor's temper, of dishes thrown, of faces slapped for minor infractions. Into this toxic environment came Thomas Abernathy in 1870. He was 19 years old, recently. Freed, with nowhere else to go, the Whitmores hired him as a stable hand. He was intelligent, literate, and learned quickly. Over the years, he worked his way up through the household ranks. By 1880, he was the head butler, managing the other servants and handling the family's accounts. Benjamin Whitmore trusted him in a way he trusted no one else, not even his own children. Thomas knew exactly how much debt the family carried. He knew which creditors were pressing hardest. He knew every secret the Whitmores thought they had hidden. Thomas married in 1875 a woman named Rebecca who worked as a laundress on a neighboring estate. She died in childbirth in 1877, leaving Thomas with an infant daughter. He named her Sarah. The Whitmores allowed Thomas to keep the child on the property, raising her in the small cabin behind the main house that served as his quarters. As Sarah grew, she began helping with minor tasks around the estate. By the time she was 14, she was working as a full housemaid. Letters preserved in the Yazoo County Historical Society archives paint a picture of life in the Whitmore household during those years. A letter from Margaret Whitmore to a friend in Mobile, dated January 1892, casually mentions "Father's trusted Thomas" and describes him as more loyal than our own blood. Another letter from Eleanor to her sister in Charleston, dated August 1892, complains about the difficulty of keeping servants and notes that at least Thomas and his girl remain faithful. The servants' quarters behind the mansion housed the 7 people who kept the estate functioning. Besides Thomas and Sarah, there was Ezekiel, the groundskeeper, a man in his 60s who had been born enslaved on the property. There was Miriam, the cook, who had worked for the Whitmores since 1873. There were 2 younger housemaids, sisters named Ada and Ruth. There was Samuel, who handled the stables and the few remaining horses. And there was James, a handyman who had only been hired 6 months before the events of October 1893. These 7 people knew things about the Whitmore family that no one else knew. They saw Benjamin's rages. They heard Jonathan's drunken confessions. They witnessed Charles returning from the woods with blood on his clothes. They cleaned up Eleanor's broken dishes and absorbed her insults. They knew which rooms in the mansion were used for what purposes. They knew about the locked room on the 3rd floor that no servant was ever allowed to enter, and Thomas Abernathy knew more than any of them. 23 years in that house had made him invisible. The Whitmores spoke freely in front of him, as if he were a piece of furniture. He had access to their correspondence, their financial records, their private conversations. He knew things that could destroy the family's remaining reputation. He knew things that could send some of them to prison. But he remained silent. He remained loyal. He remained the perfect servant. Until April 14th, 1893, when everything changed. When his daughter fell, or was pushed, or was thrown down those stairs. When the only thing Thomas Abernathy had ever loved in this world was taken from him. When the Whitmores made it clear that Sarah's life meant nothing to them. That was when the perfect servant began to plan something that would echo through history as one of the most disturbing cases of revenge ever documented. The official report filed by Constable William Pierce on April 15, 1893, is preserved in the Yazoo County Courthouse. It is a single page, written in hurried handwriting, and it tells us almost nothing. Sarah Abernathy, coloured female, age 16, employed as housemaid at Whitmore Estate, died April 14th, approximately 3 p.m. from injuries sustained in a fall down the main staircase. Accidental death. No further investigation warranted. But other documents tell a different story. A letter from Miriam, the cook, to her sister in Jackson, written 2 weeks after Sarah's death, survives in a private collection. In it, Miriam writes, "That poor girl didn't fall. I heard the shouting from the second floor. I heard her screaming. Then silence. Then Thomas found her at the bottom of those stairs, and the look on his face was like watching a man's soul leave his body. Mr. Benjamin told us all that if we spoke about what happened, we'd be dismissed without reference. In these times, that's the same as a death sentence." Another housemaid, Ada, kept a diary. Her entry for April 14th, 1893, discovered decades later when the estate was finally cleared, reads, "Sarah is dead. They say she fell, but I saw the bruises on her arms, like someone had grabbed her hard. I saw the fear in her eyes these past weeks. Mr. Charles had been watching her, following her through the house. She told me 2 days ago she was afraid. I should have done something. God forgive me, I should have done something." Thomas Abernathy requested to see his daughter's body. Benjamin Whitmore denied the request. Thomas asked to know the exact circumstances of her death. He was told to mind his place. He asked permission to contact the county coroner for an independent examination. Benjamin Whitmore told him that if he continued to cause problems, he would be dismissed from service and evicted from the property immediately, with no references and no compensation for his 23 years of work. Thomas had no legal recourse. In 1893, Mississippi, a black man's word meant nothing against a white family of standing, no matter how diminished that standing had become. The constable's report was final. Sarah was buried in the servants' cemetery on April 16th in an unmarked grave, in a pine box paid for by the Whitmores. Thomas was not given time off to mourn. He was expected at his post the next morning. The other servants reported that Thomas returned to work on April 17th, but something fundamental had changed. Ezekiel, the groundskeeper, told investigators later that Thomas moved through the house, like a ghost, there but not there. Miriam said his eyes had gone dead. "He would look at you," she said, "but he wasn't seeing you. He was seeing something else, something far away." For 6 months, from April to October, Thomas Abernathy performed his duties with mechanical perfection. He woke at 5 each morning. He supervised the other servants. He managed the household accounts. He served the family their meals. He attended to Benjamin's requests without question. He was invisible, efficient, and utterly silent. But at night, alone in his cabin, Thomas was doing something else. The leather-bound journal discovered later shows entries beginning April 20th, 1893. The early entries are in English, but the handwriting is shaky, almost violent. "They took her from me. They took everything. There is no justice in this world for men like me. No law protects us. No God hears our prayers. If there is to be justice, I must make it myself." By May, the entries begin to change. Thomas writes about researching in the mansion's library, reading books that Benjamin Whitmore had inherited from his grandfather, books about folklore, about old beliefs brought from Africa and mixed with European traditions in the dark soil of the South, books about spirits and conjure and ways to call upon forces that existed before Christian missionaries ever set foot on American shores. A particularly disturbing entry from June 3, 1893 reads, "I have found the old practices, the ones they tried to erase, the ones that survived in whispers and shadows. There are powers older than their churches, older than their laws, powers that answer to those who have nothing left to lose. I will learn, I will prepare, and when the time comes, I will open the door, and let justice flow through. By July, some entries are no longer in English. They're written in a cipher that cryptographers have never fully decoded. Other passages appear to be in languages that linguists cannot identify, mixtures of West African dialects, Creole, and something else entirely, something that doesn't match any known linguistic pattern. Thomas began making trips into the surrounding woods. Samuel, who worked in the stables, told investigators that Thomas would leave after dark, carrying a canvas bag, and return hours later with the bag full of items Samuel couldn't identify. Roots, perhaps, bones, small cloth bundles that smelled of herbs and decay. In the mansion's cellar, in a storage room that no one else had reason to visit, Thomas began assembling something. The other servants occasionally noticed items missing from around the estate. A small mirror from Eleanor's vanity, a lock of hair from Jonathan's brush, soil from the family cemetery where 3 generations of Whitmores were buried, a silver knife from the dining room, candles from the chapel. These disappearances were minor enough that no one connected them or thought to investigate. Margaret. Whitmore's diary, discovered in 1954 when the estate was finally demolished, contains an entry from September 1893. Thomas has become unsettling. He moves too quietly. He appears in rooms as if he had materialized from the walls. Father says I'm being hysterical, but I swear Thomas watches us with a look I cannot describe. Not hatred exactly, something colder, something patient. Charles Whitmore apparently noticed it too. In a letter to a friend dated September 22, 1893, he writes, "Our Butler has gone peculiar. Won't meet your eye directly anymore, mutters to himself when he thinks no one is listening. Father won't hear a word against him, says Thomas is the only competent servant we have left. But there's something wrong there. I've hunted enough to know when prey is planning to become predator. But Benjamin Whitmore dismissed all concerns. Thomas was loyal. Thomas was trustworthy. Thomas had served the family for more than 2 decades. Benjamin believed that Thomas knew his place, accepted the natural order of things, and would never dare to act against the family. Benjamin Whitmore was catastrophically wrong. The last entry in Thomas's journal before the storm is dated October 30th, 1893. It reads, "Tomorrow night, the storm is coming. I have seen it in my dreams. The heavens will open and the roads will close and we will be alone together in this house. The house where Sarah died. The house where they killed her and called it an accident. Tomorrow night, the soon debts will be paid. I have prepared the way. I have opened the doors. I have called to those who answer the cries of the wronged. They are listening. They are waiting. They are hungry." On October 31st, 1893, the storm began. By nightfall, the Whitmore Estate was completely isolated from the outside world. 8 people were in the mansion, the 5 members of the Whitmore family, and 3 servants who lived in the main house rather than the quarters, Thomas, Miriam, and young Ruth. The other servants had retreated to their cabins behind the mansion. What happened over the next 3 days would become one of the most disturbing and unexplained incidents in Mississippi history. When the authorities finally reached the estate on November 3rd, they found a scene that some of them would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. Tell us in the comments what you think was happening during those 6 months while Thomas prepared. Was this carefully planned human revenge? Or was he truly attempting to invoke something beyond our understanding? Your theories matter as we continue to uncover this dark history. The storm arrived with apocalyptic fury. Weather records from the National Weather Service archives indicate that between October 31st and November 2nd, 1893, the region received over 14 inches of rain. Wind speeds exceeded 60 miles per hour. Lightning struck the estate grounds repeatedly, setting fire to one of the old slave quarters, which burned to the ground despite the torrential downpour. Inside the mansion, the Whitmore family gathered for dinner on the evening of October 31st. The menu, recorded in the household ledger that Thomas maintained, listed roasted duck, potatoes, green beans, and apple pie. Thomas served the meal. Miriam had prepared it. Ruth stood ready to clear plates and refill glasses. Eleanor Whitmore's diary contains her final entry, written earlier that day. A dreadful storm is coming. The servants are nervous. Even Thomas seems distracted, though he performs his duties as always. We will dine together tonight and weather this tempest, as Whitmores have weathered every storm for 3 generations. We are survivors. According to testimony later given by Miriam, the dinner proceeded normally until approximately 8:30 p.m. The family was finishing dessert when the lights went out, not just dimmed, but extinguished completely and simultaneously, all throughout the mansion. The oil lamps, the candles, even the fireplace in the dining room, all snuffed out in the same instant, as if by a great invisible hand. Margaret Whitmore screamed. In the darkness, someone or something laughed. Miriam would later tell investigators that the laugh came from everywhere and nowhere, that it sounded like multiple voices speaking in unison, and that it definitely was not Thomas's voice, though he was the only servant in the dining room at that moment. When Benjamin managed to relight a candle using matches from his pocket, they saw that Thomas was no longer in the room. The door to the kitchen stood open. Beyond it, darkness and the sound of rain hammering against windows. Jonathan, drunk as usual, declared he would find the butler and beat sense into him. He grabbed a candlestick and stormed toward the kitchen. Charles followed with a hunting knife he always kept on his belt. Benjamin ordered the women to remain in the dining room while he went to check the main fuse box in the cellar. This was the moment when the Whitmore family made their fatal mistake. They separated. They divided their strength. They moved apart into the darkness of a house they thought they knew, not understanding that the mansion they had lived in for decades had become something else during those 6 months while Thomas prepared. Jonathan Whitmore never returned from the kitchen. After 20 minutes, when Charles went to look for his brother, he found the kitchen empty. The back door stood open. Rain poured in, pooling on the floor. On the kitchen table sat a single object, a small doll made from corn husks and black fabric, with pins driven through its chest and throat. Charles picked up the doll. His hand immediately began to bleed, though he hadn't pricked himself on the pins. He dropped the object and backed away. On the wall above the table, written in what appeared to be ash or charcoal, were symbols Charles didn't recognize. Circles within circles, spirals, angular marks that hurt to look at. Directly, he ran back to the dining room to find his father had not returned from the cellar. Margaret was crying. Eleanor sat rigid in her chair, staring at nothing. Ruth, the young housemaid, stood pressed against the wall, trembling. Miriam was praying in a low whisper. "We need to leave," Charles said. "Now, something is very wrong here." But when they tried to open the front door, they found it wouldn't budge, not locked, but sealed as if the wood had fused with the frame. Charles threw his shoulder against it with all his strength. The door didn't even shudder. The windows were the same. The glass had become something else, something that wouldn't break no matter how hard they struck it. They were trapped inside. In the cellar, Benjamin Whitmore had discovered something that would explain much of what was about to occur, though he would not live long enough to share the information. The storage room where Thomas had been assembling his preparations stood open. Inside, Benjamin, who found an altar of sorts, 7 candles arranged in a circle. In the center, a photograph of Sarah Abernathy, surrounded by objects Benjamin recognized, items stolen from around the house over the past months. His own hair, Eleanor's mirror, soiled from the family cemetery, and in the very center, a book bound in leather so old it was nearly black, open to a page covered in symbols and text in a language Benjamin had never seen. The candles were burning, though no one had lit them. As Benjamin stared, unable to move, unable to look away, a shadow detached itself from the corner of the room. It was Thomas, but not Thomas. His eyes reflected the candlelight like an animal's. When he spoke, his voice had layers to it, as if others were speaking through him. "You took everything from me," Thomas said. "Now I take everything from you, not just your lives, your souls, your eternity. You will know what it means to be powerless. You will know what it means to beg for mercy and receive none." Benjamin Whitmore opened his mouth to reply, to command, to threaten, but no sound emerged. His throat had closed. And as Thomas stepped forward, the shadows in the room grew darker and deeper, moving with purpose, reaching out with fingers made of absence and cold. Upstairs, the family heard a scream from the cellar. It was Benjamin's voice, but it went on far too long, rising in pitch and agony, before cutting off abruptly. Dawn never came on November 1st, or if it did, no light penetrated the unnatural darkness that had settled over the Whitmore Estate. The storm continued without pause. The 4 survivors in the dining room, Charles, Margaret, Eleanor, and the 2 servants, Miriam and Ruth, huddled together by candlelight, listening to sounds they couldn't explain. Footsteps on the floor above them, though no one was up there, scratching inside the walls, voices whispering in languages that predated English by centuries, and occasionally laughter. That same multi-layered laugh they had heard when the lights went out. Charles organized what he believed was a rational response. They would barricade themselves in the dining room. They would wait out the storm. When help arrived, they would tell them that Thomas had gone insane and murdered Benjamin and Jonathan. The law would handle it. Everything would return to normal. But Eleanor knew better. Somewhere in the decades of her life, in the stories her grandmother had told her, in the warnings that plantation owners whispered to each other about what the enslaved people knew and practiced in secret, she understood what was happening. She grabbed Charles's arm and said with perfect clarity, "We are being judged, and we have been found guilty." Margaret refused to accept this. She was 25 years old, engaged to be married, her whole life ahead of her. She would not die in this house. She would not. She grabbed one of the heavy silver candlesticks from the dining table and announced she was going to find a way out, even if she had to break through a wall. Charles tried to stop her, but Margaret had inherited the Whitmore stubbornness. She left the dining room and headed toward the library, reasoning that the windows there faced the front lawn and might be more vulnerable. Charles followed, unwilling to let his sister go alone. They never reached the library. In the hallway they encountered something that would shatter Charles's rationality forever. Hovering in the middle of the corridor, illuminated by their candles, was Jonathan, or what had been Jonathan. His body floated 3 feet above the floor, arms spread wide, head tilted back. His eyes were open, but solid black. His mouth moved, but the voice that emerged was not his own. "She suffered," the voice said, using Jonathan's mouth. "She fell, and she felt every bone break, and she called for her father, and no one came. She died alone and afraid. Now you will know her fear." Jonathan's body dropped to the floor with a wet sound. Charles screamed and ran back toward the dining room, but Margaret stood frozen, unable to move, staring at her brother's corpse. That's when Thomas emerged from a doorway that had definitely been a wall moments before. He carried no weapon. He didn't need one. The air around him rippled like heat waves. The temperature in the hallway dropped so rapidly that Margaret's breath came out in clouds. Thomas raised one hand, and Margaret rose into the air, lifted by invisible forces, her feet kicking uselessly. "Your brother liked to hurt things," Thomas said, his voice still layered with others. Small things, weak things. He thought it made him powerful. Let me show him, through you, what real power looks like. What happened next is documented only in Charles Whitmore's testimony, given 3 weeks later while confined to a psychiatric facility in Jackson. The doctors noted that his account was fragmentary and possibly influenced by severe psychological trauma. Charles claimed that Margaret didn't die. Not exactly. He said she was unmade, taken apart and put back together wrong, turned inside out in ways that violated physical law. He said that what Thomas did to her took hours, though only minutes passed. He said the screaming never stopped, even after Margaret's body had been reduced to something that could no longer produce sound. Charles ran. He burst back into the dining room, grabbed his mother and dragged her toward the servants' stairs, hoping to reach the second floor and perhaps find a way out through the roof. Ruth and Miriam followed, having no other choice. They made it halfway up the stairs before they realized Thomas was already waiting at the top. "You cannot run from this," he said. "This house is mine now. Every room, every shadow, every breath of air. I have rewritten the rules that govern this place. I have invited guests that your Christ cannot banish. Tonight, you pay for Sarah. Tomorrow, you pay for every indignity, every cruelty, every life you ruined without thought or consequence." Eleanor Whitmore, who had remained silent since her prophecy in the dining room, finally spoke. "We killed her, didn't we? It wasn't an accident." Thomas tilted his head, studying her. "You knew." "I suspected, but I said nothing, because her life meant nothing to us." Eleanor's voice was utterly flat. "Do what you must. I will not beg." Thomas nodded slowly. "You at least see clearly. That changes nothing, but it means your end will be quicker." He gestured and Eleanor simply ceased. One moment she was standing on the stairs, the next moment she was gone, not collapsed or killed, but erased, leaving not even a body behind. Charles screamed his mother's name. Ruth fainted. Miriam began to pray louder, calling on Jesus, on Mary, on all the saints. Thomas looked at Miriam and said with something approaching gentleness, "Your God is not here. He has never been here. Go to your quarters, take the girl. You were not cruel. You will be spared." Miriam grabbed Ruth and fled, half carrying the younger woman down the stairs and out through a door that had suddenly, impossibly opened. The storm swallowed them as they ran toward the servants' cabins. Charles was alone with Thomas on the stairs. The last Whitmore standing. Charles Whitmore survived the second night. How he survived is unclear even from his own testimony. He remembered running through the mansion, through rooms that had changed shape and orientation, through doorways that led to places that shouldn't exist within the physical structure of the house. He remembered seeing things in the shadows, figures that watched him with eyes that reflected no light, shapes that moved in ways that hurt to perceive. He remembered finding himself in the locked third-floor room, the one that no servant had ever been allowed to enter. Inside, he discovered why. The room was filled with photographs, dozens of them. Some were old daguerreotypes from the 1850s. Others were more recent. All showed young women, black women, servants who had worked for the Whitmore family over the decades. And in the margins of many photographs, notes in his grandfather's handwriting, his father's handwriting, his brother's handwriting. Notes that described things Charles could barely comprehend through his panic and horror. This was the secret the family had kept. This was what Thomas had discovered while managing the household records, while having access to correspondence and diaries that were supposed to remain private. The Whitmore men had a tradition, passed from father to son, a belief that they owned not just the labor of their servants, but their bodies, their dignity, their very humanity. Sarah had not been the first. She had been the latest in a line stretching back generations. and Thomas had found proof. He had seen the photographs. He had read the letters. He had discovered that his daughter's death was not an accident or even a crime of passion, but part of a pattern, a legacy of predation that the Whitmore family considered their right. Charles remained in that room through the night, surrounded by the evidence of his family's sins, understanding finally why Thomas had done what he had done, understanding that if there was any justice in the universe, it would look exactly like this. On the morning of November 3rd, when the storm finally broke and the roads became passable again, Sheriff Marcus Wheeler and Deputy Frank Morrison made their way to the Whitmore Estate to check on the family's welfare. They had received no communication from the property in 3 days, which was unusual even during severe weather. What they found would be documented in official reports that remain sealed in the Yazoo County archives to this day. The public version, printed in newspapers throughout Mississippi, was carefully sanitized. But the full reports, obtained by researchers decades later through legal channels, tell a different story. They found Benjamin Whitmore's body in the cellar, positioned at the center of a circle of burned-out candles. His face was frozen in an expression that Deputy Morrison described as beyond terror, beyond any emotion humans should be capable of experiencing. The coroner would later note that Benjamin's heart had simply stopped, though he showed no signs of disease or physical trauma. Cause of death was officially listed as cardiac arrest due to unknown factors. Jonathan Whitmore was discovered in the hallway outside the library. His body showed signs of trauma inconsistent with any known weapon or method of injury. The coroner's report mentioned structural impossibilities and patterns of damage that suggest forces outside normal physical parameters. Cause of death was officially listed as misadventure during the storm. Margaret Whitmore was found in her bedroom on the 2nd floor. The door had been locked from the inside, the windows were intact. But Margaret was dead, and the condition of her body violated so many principles of forensic medicine that 3 different coroners examined her remains before anyone was willing to sign a death certificate. The official cause of death was listed simply as unknown. Eleanor Whitmore was never found. Not her body, not her clothing, not any trace that she had existed. She was officially listed as missing, presumed dead. Charles Whitmore was discovered alive, catatonic in the locked 3rd-floor room. He was unharmed, physically, but completely unresponsive. The photographs and documents that should have filled the room were gone, burned to ash, though there was no sign of fire damage to the structure itself. Charles was taken to Jackson and confined to a psychiatric facility, where he would remain for the next 17 years before dying of pneumonia in 1910. The most disturbing discovery came when the investigators entered Thomas Abernathy's cabin behind the mansion. Inside, they found his journal, left, open on the table as if he had wanted it to be found. The final entry, dated November 3rd, read, "It is finished. The debt is paid. Sarah can rest now. As for me, I am no longer what I was. The doors I opened cannot be closed. The things I invited in do not leave. I will walk into the deep woods now, and I will not return. Let history remember me as a monster if it wishes. I have become what I needed to become to achieve justice in a world that offers none to people like me." Searchers combed the woods for weeks. They found no trace of Thomas Abernathy. He had vanished as completely as Eleanor Whitmore, though under very different circumstances. In the servants' quarters, Miriam and Ruth had survived, along with the other servants who had remained in their cabins during the storm. Their testimonies were taken, but largely dismissed by authorities who preferred the official narrative. A series of tragic accidents and one disappearance during a severe storm. The suggestion that Thomas might have been responsible was included in reports, but no charges could be filed against a missing man, and no evidence directly connected him to any deaths. The Whitmore Estate was inherited by a distant cousin from Virginia who took one look at the property and immediately put it up for sale. No buyer could be found. The mansion stood empty for decades, slowly decaying. Locals avoided it. Stories spread. Some claimed to see lights in the windows on October 31st each year. Others reported hearing screaming from inside, even though the house was empty and boarded up. In 1947, a fire of unknown origin destroyed the main structure. By the time fire crews from Yazoo City arrived, only the stone foundation and the 6 columns remained standing. No investigation into the fire's cause was ever completed. The official report simply states, "Origin undetermined. Property deemed total loss." But the story didn't end with the fire, because over the following decades, evidence would continue to surface, letters would be found, diaries would be donated to historical societies, and researchers would begin to piece together a picture of what truly happened during those 3 nights in October 1893. A picture that suggested Thomas Abernathy had achieved something unprecedented, something that, depending on your perspective, was either the darkest revenge in American history or perhaps the only form of justice available to a man with no power, no rights, and nothing left to lose. The official story of the Whitmore Estate might have ended with the fire in 1947, but history has a way of refusing to stay buried. Over the following decades, fragments of evidence continued to surface, each adding new layers to an already disturbing narrative. In 1952, a graduate student named Patricia Hendricks from the University of Mississippi was researching Southern folklore for her thesis. While examining records at the Yazoo County Historical Society, she discovered a box of letters that had been donated anonymously in 1949. The letters were correspondence between various servants who had worked on plantations throughout Mississippi in the late 1800s. Among them were 3 letters written by Miriam, the cook who survived the events at the Whitmore Estate. The letters, written to her sister between 1893 and 1895, provide the most detailed eyewitness account we have of the aftermath. In a letter dated December 1893, Miriam writes, "I cannot sleep without seeing it again. Not what happened to the family, though that was terrible enough, but what Thomas had become by the end. He was no longer a man. His shadow moved wrong. His reflection in mirrors showed something else." The morning after, before they took me for questioning, I went to his cabin. The walls inside were covered in writing. Some of it was in languages I recognized from my grandmother's stories, languages from across the ocean. But some of it was in no earthly tongue. And the smell, Lord help me, the smell was like opening a grave. Another letter from April 1894 mentions that Ruth, the young housemaid who also survived, had been found dead in her bed with no apparent cause. "The doctor said her heart simply stopped," Miriam wrote, "but I saw her face. She died terrified. I think she saw something in the darkness. I think what Thomas unleashed in that house followed some of us out." The most chilling letter, dated November 1895, exactly 2 years after the events, reads, "Every year on that night I feel him watching. Not Thomas the man, but what he became. I believe he's still out there in those woods, or what's left of him is. The trees around where the estate stood have changed. They grow in twisted shapes now. Animals won't go near them. The locals have started calling it the Dead Grove. They say if you go there on October 31st, you can still hear the Whitmores screaming. I will never go back. I have moved to Memphis to be away from it. But distance doesn't seem to matter. He knows where I am. They all do." In 1963, a local historian named Robert Cassidy published a small press book titled Dark Mississippi: Forgotten Tragedies of the Delta. One chapter focused on the Whitmore Estate. Cassidy had interviewed elderly residents of Yazoo County who remembered the events or had heard stories from their parents. Several accounts stood out. An 80-year-old man named Jacob Morrison, whose father had been one of the deputies who investigated the scene in 1893, claimed his father never spoke about what he saw except once on his deathbed in 1931. He told me that when they found Benjamin Whitmore's body in the cellar, there were symbols drawn on the floor around him in ash, and when they tried to photograph the scene, every photograph came out blank except for shadows in the shapes of people who weren't there. My father said he stopped believing in coincidence after that day. Another interview subject, a woman named Esther Williams, whose grandmother had lived near the estate, reported, "Grandmama said that after the storm, the land itself felt wrong. Crops wouldn't grow within a mile of the property. Wells went bad. Livestock that grazed too close would sicken and die. By 1900, every farm within 2 miles of the old Whitmore place had been abandoned. People said the ground had been poisoned, but not by anything natural." Perhaps most significantly, Cassidy discovered records of Charles Whitmore's confinement at the Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum in Jackson. Charles had been largely nonverbal for the first 14 years of his institutionalization, but in 1907 he began speaking again. A doctor's notes from that period, preserved in medical archives, document Charles's statements. "Patient claims he understands now what occurred," Dr. Lawrence Pemberton wrote in March 1907. He states that his family had committed crimes against their servants for generations, and that Thomas Abernathy discovered evidence of these crimes. Patient believes Abernathy used old practices and forbidden knowledge to exact revenge. Most disturbingly, Patient insists that Abernathy succeeded in something unprecedented. He claims Abernathy opened a door between worlds and invited ancient judgments into the house. Patient shows no signs of delusion or fantasy when discussing these events. He speaks with absolute clarity and conviction. However, the content of his statement suggests severe psychological trauma has created an elaborate coping mechanism to explain accidental deaths. In another note from 1908, Dr. Pemberton writes, "Patient has drawn pictures of symbols he claims were in his father's cellar and on the walls of Abernathy's cabin. I have shown these drawings to colleagues with expertise in anthropology and religious studies. They identify some symbols as West African in origin, possibly Yoruba or Dahomey. Others resemble Haitian Vodou waves. Still others match no known tradition." One colleague, Dr. Martin, became visibly disturbed when viewing the drawings and refused to comment further. In 1976, the land where the Whitmore Estate once stood was purchased by a development company planning to build a residential subdivision. Construction began in May. By September, the project was abandoned. Workers reported equipment malfunctions, accidents, and a general sense of unease on the property. 3 workers quit after claiming they heard voices coming from underground. 2 others reported seeing a figure watching them from the tree line, a tall black man in old-fashioned clothing who would vanish when approached. The project foreman, in an interview with the Yazoo City newspaper, stated, "I've worked construction for 30 years. I don't believe in ghosts or curses, but something is wrong with that land. The ground feels wrong when you walk on it. The air is heavier there, and every single person on my crew reported feeling watched. We found animal bones arranged in patterns near where the old mansion stood, fresh bones arranged recently, but there are no houses nearby, no people living out there. Who's doing it? I don't know, and I don't want to know. The company can find another foreman if they want to continue. I'm done." The land has remained undeveloped since 1976. It sits empty, gradually being reclaimed by the forest. The few locals who remember the story avoid it. Teenagers occasionally dare each other to spend time there on Halloween night, but few last more than an hour before the pervasive sense of wrongness drives them away. In 1998, A paranormal investigation team from Tulane University conducted a study of the site. They recorded dozens of anomalous readings, temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic disturbances, and audio recordings that captured voices speaking in languages the team couldn't identify. The lead investigator, Dr. Sarah Chen, published a paper suggesting the location showed signs of persistent environmental trauma and residual psychic imprinting of extreme events. Most recently, in 2019, genealogical research conducted by the African American Heritage Foundation traced descendants of Thomas Abernathy to a family living in Detroit. When contacted about their ancestor, the family declined to comment publicly, but provided a single photograph to researchers. The photograph, dated approximately 1870, shows a young Thomas Abernathy standing beside Sarah's mother, Rebecca. Thomas is smiling in the image. It's the only known photograph of him. On the back of the photograph in faded ink, someone had written, "Before the world broke him, before he broke the world back." The question that haunts researchers is not whether Thomas Abernathy killed the Whitmore family. The evidence suggests he was responsible, though the exact methods remain unclear. The real question is what he became in the process. Did he simply plan and execute a brilliant revenge using psychological terror and perhaps some poisoning? Or did he actually succeed in accessing something older and darker, something that the enslaved peoples of the South had kept alive in whispers and warnings? The answer depends on what evidence you choose to believe and what possibilities you're willing to accept exist in a world that rarely offers justice to those who need it most. The Whitmore Estate case remains officially unsolved. The Yazoo County Sheriff's Department classifies it as a series of accidental deaths during a severe storm, with 2 individuals missing and presumed dead. No criminal charges were ever filed. No trial ever took place. The case file, what remains accessible to the public, offers no definitive answers. But the fragments we've examined tonight paint a very different picture. They suggest that in October 1893, in a decaying mansion in rural Mississippi, something unprecedented occurred. Whether it was the methodical revenge of a grieving father who had nothing left to lose, or something darker, something that transcended the boundaries between the living world and whatever lies beyond, we may never know with certainty. 3 primary theories have emerged over the decades, each with its supporters and its evidence. The first theory, favored by skeptics and rationalists, suggests that Thomas Abernathy planned and executed a series of murders using conventional means. According to this interpretation, he poisoned the family over the course of the 3 days, used his intimate knowledge of the house to create psychological terror, and staged the scene to appear supernatural. His journal entries about spirits and old practices were simply the writings of a man driven to madness by grief, rationalizing his actions through a framework of mysticism. The strange phenomena reported by survivors and investigators were either fabricated, exaggerated, or the result of mass hysteria during a traumatic event. This theory has problems. It doesn't explain Eleanor Whitmore's complete disappearance. It doesn't account for the condition of Margaret's body, which multiple coroners found inexplicable. It doesn't address the persistent reports of anomalies at the site over the following 130 years, but it offers the comfort of staying within the boundaries of accepted reality. The second theory proposes that Thomas did access genuine occult knowledge. According to this interpretation, the enslaved peoples brought to America carried with them spiritual practices that survived, despite brutal suppression. These practices, mixed with indigenous American traditions and European folk magic, created something unique in the Mississippi Delta. Thomas, desperate and with nothing to lose, researched these old ways, performed rituals that actually worked, and opened doors that should have remained closed. What happened to the Whitmores was not murder in the conventional sense, but something older, a form of spiritual justice that operated outside modern understanding. This theory is supported by the symbols documented in multiple sources, the testimonies of survivors who described impossible events, and the persistent strangeness of the location itself. It suggests that there are forces in this world that science hasn't yet explained and may never explain, forces that answer to those who know how to call them. The third theory, perhaps the most disturbing, suggests that both explanations are partially correct. Thomas killed the Whitmores through conventional means, poison or violence, but in the process of planning his revenge, in the depth of his grief and rage, he genuinely believed he was invoking supernatural aid. And somehow, through belief or coincidence or something we don't have words for, the universe responded. The boundaries between psychological and supernatural broke down. Thomas's conviction that he was channeling ancient powers became real through sheer force of will and suffering. He didn't just kill his enemies. He transformed himself into something that could kill them, and that transformation was so complete that he ceased to be human by the end. Which theory is correct? The evidence supports elements of all three and definitively proves none. Perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some events are meant to remain ambiguous, existing in the space between explanation and mystery. What we know for certain is this: Sarah Abernathy died on April 14th, 1893. She was 16 years old. She had no voice, no power, no protection under the law. Her death was ruled an accident, and her life was considered expendable. 6 months later, the family responsible for her death was destroyed. Whether that destruction came through human cunning, supernatural intervention, or some combination of both, it represented a form of justice that the legal system of 1893 Mississippi would never have provided. Thomas Abernathy disappeared into the woods and was never seen again. The land where these events occurred remains empty and avoided to this day. And every October 31st, some claim, if you stand at the edge of what locals still call the Dead Grove and listen carefully, you can hear echoes of that long-ago storm, and beneath it, the sound of a father's grief transformed into something that refuses to be forgotten. To this day, no one knows the complete truth of what happened during those 3 nights. No one knows what Thomas Abernathy truly became, or where he went, or if some part of him still walks those woods, keeping watch over his daughter's unmarked grave. Some mysteries are meant to haunt us, some stories refuse to end. This has been our journey into the shadows of the Whitmore Estate. If you've made it this far, thank you for being part of our haunted community. These stories matter. These forgotten tragedies deserve to be remembered, examined, and discussed. Leave your theories in the comments below. Tell us what you believe happened. Was it human revenge, supernatural justice, or something? Beyond either category, your insights help keep these histories alive. If you enjoyed this investigation into forgotten darkness, please subscribe and ring the notification bell. We have many more buried stories to uncover, many more mysteries that history tried to erase. Join us next time as we descend deeper into the archives of the unexplained. Until then, remember, the past is never truly past. It waits in old houses, in sealed records, in stories passed down through generations. And sometimes, if you listen carefully enough, it speaks. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay with us in the shadows.